giants, and the giants start devouring the earth, and that's what elicits the flood. But after the flood, it destroys the giant bodies, but their spirits, which are these hybrid, really bastard spirits, mixes of two types, continue to roam the earth as evil spirits.
There is a fragment of parchment sitting inside a climate-controlled vault in Jerusalem right now. It is roughly the size of a man's palm. Its edges are burned black. Its Hebrew letters are faded to the color of ash. And the scholars who first translated it in the 1950s went very quiet afterward. This is not a rumor. This is not a theory. This is the documented history of what happened when Cave 4 at Qumran gave up its contents, nearly 15,000 manuscript fragments, many of them pulled from the dirt in pieces, many of them rushed into private hands before any government could intervene. Among those fragments was a text that had not been read by human eyes in roughly 2,000 years, a text that spoke of giants, not as legend, not as poetry, as memory. The camera does not linger on the cave mouth for long. It cannot, because the real discovery was never in the cave. It was in what the cave forced scholars to ask, a question so uncomfortable that several of the original Dead Sea Scrolls research team actively fought to delay its publication for decades. What does it mean that one of the oldest surviving bodies of Jewish scripture describes the Nephilim not as a past event, but as an ongoing presence? Genesis 6:4 uses 4 words that have never been fully explained. And also after that. After what? After the sons of God came to the daughters of men. After the earth filled with violence. After the flood that was supposed to erase everything. The text does not say. It simply leaves the door open. And for thousands of years, that open door has let something walk through. Hi viewers, before this story goes deeper, here is a question only you can answer. When you first heard the word Nephilim, what was the very first thing that came to your mind? Drop it in the comments right now. There is no wrong answer, and what people write below this video may be more revealing than anything in this script. The Book of Giants, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls and written in Aramaic, does not describe the Nephilim the way Sunday school taught. It describes them as enormous, violent, and deeply troubled. Troubled because they begin having dreams. Dreams of a flood, dreams of tablets being destroyed, dreams of a divine judgment so total and so final that even they, creatures of extraordinary power, cannot stop it. These are not the giants of fairy tales. These are beings recorded in ancient manuscript form, dreaming about their own destruction, and the record of their terror survived 2,000 years of war, fire, and silence to reach this moment. And here is where it gets harder to explain away. The team of scholars assigned to the Dead Sea Scrolls, a group that included John Allegro, Roland de Vaux, and others working under the École Biblique in Jerusalem, did not release the majority of the texts to the public for nearly 40 years after discovery. 40 years. The official explanation was that translation takes time. But Allegro himself, in letters now preserved in the British Library, wrote that certain members of the team were alarmed by what the texts implied about the biblical narrative, alarmed enough to slow the process deliberately. That is not speculation. That is documented correspondence. So here is what is known. Ancient manuscripts exist. They describe beings of extraordinary size and corrupted origin. They describe divine judgment against those beings. And then, in 4 quiet words, the oldest version of the biblical text leaves open the possibility that the judgment did not finish the job. And also after that, 4 words, 2,000 years of silence, and 1 burned fragment in a Jerusalem vault that someone clearly did not want the world to read. What the next chapter reveals about where those beings came from, and what 3 separate ancient civilizations independently recorded about them, will change the way this entire story reads from the beginning. 1,200 miles from Qumran, carved into stone tablets that predate Moses by 1,000 years, the Sumerians recorded a word, Anunnaki. Scholars translate it most commonly as those who came from the heavens to earth. The Sumerians were not reading Genesis. Genesis had not been written yet. And yet the structure of what they described, divine beings descending, taking human partners, producing offspring of unusual power and destructive capacity, mirrors the Genesis account with a precision that stopped early comparative religion scholars cold. This is not coincidence chasing. This is linguistic and archaeological convergence across cultures that had no documented contact with each other. The Hebrew word at the root of Nephilim is itself contested. Some scholars derive it from the root naphil, meaning to fall, making the Nephilim the fallen ones. Others connect it to an Aramaic root meaning giants, or those who cause others to fall. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced in Alexandria around 250 BCE, translates the word directly as gigants, which is where the English word giant originates. 3 different language traditions, 3 different time periods, and they all point toward the same category of being: powerful, descended, and outside the natural human order. Numbers 13:33 is the verse most people miss. When the 12 Israelite spies return from Canaan, they do not just say the land is fortified. They say they saw the Nephilim there, specifically the descendants of Anak, a name that appears repeatedly in connection with giant clans in the Hebrew text. They say, "We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them." This verse appears long after the flood, long after the supposed elimination of the Nephilim. The text does not explain how. It simply records that they were there. And then the Ugaritic texts enter the record. Discovered at Ras Shamra in modern Syria beginning in 1929, the Ugaritic tablets are written in a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew and date to roughly 1400 BCE. They describe a group called the Rephaim, a word that appears in the Hebrew Bible as well, often alongside the Nephilim or used in reference to the giant clans of Canaan. In the Ugaritic texts, the Rephaim are not simply large men. They are beings connected to the divine assembly, inhabitants of a space between the human and the divine, described in ritual texts that invoke their presence from the underworld. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 catalog them with the specificity of a military report. Og, king of Bashan, is described as the last of the Rephaim. His iron bed, documented in the text as being approximately 13.5 feet long, was still on display in the city of Rabbah at the time of writing, presented as physical evidence available for anyone to verify. The ancient author was not writing mythology. He was writing the equivalent of a footnote. Go look, the object is still there. Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period describe battles against peoples of the Levant who are noted for their unusual physical stature. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, commissioned by Ramesses III around 1180 BCE, show enemy combatants of dramatically varied sizes in ways that Egyptian military art does not typically portray. Mainstream Egyptology has interpreted these as artistic convention. A smaller number of researchers in comparative ancient studies have pointed out that the variation is unusually consistent and unusually extreme for simple stylistic choice. 3 civilizations, 3 independent textual traditions, 3 bodies of physical and inscriptional evidence, none of them in contact with the others at the time of their recording, and all 3 pointing toward the same unresolved question that Genesis 6:4 left open. But none of that prepares for what the next discovery revealed, because the beings described in these records were not simply large. According to the oldest surviving account of their origin, they were the product of a transgression so catastrophic that it required an entirely separate class of divine judgment. And that account was deliberately removed from the Bible most of the world reads. The text that explains everything was taken out. Not lost, not forgotten. Taken out by a council of religious authorities meeting in Laodicea in 363 CE, who voted to exclude the Book of Enoch from the official biblical canon. The same text that Jude quotes directly in the New Testament. The same text that the early church father Tertullian defended as authentic scripture. The same text that was preserved, copied, and treated as sacred by the Jewish community at Qumran. the same people who stored the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when Ethiopia's ancient Christian church compiled what remains the world's most expansive biblical canon, they put one Enoch back in. It is scripture in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition to this day. What is inside it is not comfortable reading. First, Enoch opens with a group identified as the Watchers, a class of divine beings assigned to observe and guard humanity. The Hebrew term is Erin, used in Daniel 4 as well, where a watcher descends from heaven with a message of judgment. In 1 Enoch, 200 of these watchers gather on a mountain called Hermon, a real mountain, still standing on the border of modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, its peak reaching nearly 9,200 feet, and they make a pact. They will descend. They will take human wives, and they understand clearly that what they are doing violates divine order. The text records that they swore an oath to each other, binding themselves to the decision so none could turn back. The offspring of that union are described in 1 Enoch chapter 7 with arresting specificity. They grew to 300 cubits. They consumed everything humanity produced. When the food ran out, they turned on humanity itself. And then they turned on each other. The earth, 1 Enoch records, made accusation against the lawless ones. The violence was not simply physical. It was a corruption of the created order so complete that the earth itself registered the offense. This is where the Book of Giants, the Qumran text, picks up the story. And what it adds is extraordinary. The giants are not simply violent. They are frightened. 2 of them, identified in the fragments as Ahia and Hahia, begin having nightmares. The manuscript is damaged in places, but what survives describes tablets being submerged in water, a garden being consumed by fire, and a figure associated with divine authority announcing that the time of the giants is finished. They send one of their number, a figure the text calls Mahue, to find Enoch, who is described as a scribe of righteousness now dwelling apart from humanity, to ask him to interpret the dreams. Enoch sends back a written reply carried on a tablet. His answer is not reassuring. The judgment is real, it is coming, and it is final. Jude 14 and 15 in the New Testament quotes this tradition directly. Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about these men. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone. The phrasing 7th from Adam matches 1 Enoch's own account of Enoch's lineage. The early church did not dispute that Jude was drawing on Enoch's tradition. They disputed whether that made Enoch canonical, and they resolved the dispute.
God is used, for example, in Job. This is referring to a group of and what we would call angelic beings.
Yes.
So the ancient texts, including ancient Jewish texts, will use small g gods to refer to them, but that makes us really uncomfortable.
2 Peter 2:4 records the outcome for the watchers themselves. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. The word translated Tartarus is used nowhere else in the New Testament. It is a term borrowed from Greek cosmology to describe the deepest possible place of imprisonment. The Apostle Peter, writing in Greek to a Greek-literate audience, reached for the most extreme word available to describe where these beings were confined. Confined, not destroyed. The text does not say they were eliminated. It says they were bound. And 1 Enoch chapter 10 specifies the duration of that binding until the day of judgment. Until, not permanently, until a specific moment. That detail changes the entire shape of Genesis 6:4. And also after that. If the watchers were bound rather than destroyed, and if the Nephilim were their offspring, and if the flood was directed at the Nephilim rather than at their imprisoned fathers, then the question of what happened to the lineage of the Nephilim after the flood is not answered anywhere in the canonical text. It is simply left open. And what archaeology pulled out of the ground next, in the hills of Canaan, in the ruins of cities the Bible names by name, suggests the ancient world was not finished asking that question either. In 1930, archaeologist John Garstang excavated Jericho and found something that did not make it into the popular reports. Among the skeletal remains recovered from the Bronze Age levels of the site were bones that his team noted as significantly outside the normal range for the population. His field notes, archived at the University of Liverpool, document the anomaly. The official published report did not feature it prominently. This is not conspiracy. This is how archaeology has always worked. What fits the current model gets elevated, what disrupts it gets footnoted. Jericho is a city the Bible names explicitly as a stronghold of the Anakim, one of the giant clans cataloged in the Hebrew text alongside the Nephilim lineage. Joshua 11:21 describes Joshua cutting off the Anakim from the hill country of Hebron, Debir, and Anab. The text says the survivors fled to Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, Philistine cities on the Mediterranean coast. Gath, the archaeologists now confirm, is identified with Tel-e-Safi. And the most famous resident of Gath in biblical tradition is Goliath, himself identified in 1 Samuel 17 as standing 6 cubits and a span, approximately 9 feet by the standard cubit measurement of the ancient Near East. His brothers are named in 2 Samuel 21, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, and an unnamed warrior described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a genetic anomaly called polydactyly, which appears in the medical literature and in multiple ancient skeletal finds across the Near East and Mediterranean. Tel-e-Safi, ancient Gath, has been under systematic excavation since 1996 by Bar-Ilan University. The site has produced monumental architecture, evidence of Philistine cultural material going back to the Iron Age, and occupational layers consistent with the biblical timeline for Gath's prominence. The dig is real. The city is real. And the biblical record of giant clans, concentrated specifically in the cities, the text names is consistent with the archaeological geography of those sites. Hebron, the city most prominently associated with the Anakim in the Hebrew text, sits in the southern Judean hills at an elevation of approximately 3,050 feet. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Numbers 13 identifies it as the specific location where the spies encountered the sons of Anak, the Nephilim descendants who made the Israelites feel like grasshoppers. The excavation history at Hebron is complicated by political circumstances, but what has been documented shows occupational continuity reaching back to the Chalcolithic period, well before the biblical account places the Anakim there. The Smithsonian Institution holds in its archived correspondence a series of 19th century letters from field agents documenting skeletal finds across the Ohio Valley and the American Southwest that were noted for extraordinary size. These letters are part of the public record. The 1877 annual report of the Smithsonian itself references discoveries of this category. What happened to the physical specimens those letters described is genuinely unknown, not because of any single dramatic suppression event, but because 19th century American archaeological practice had no standardized curation protocols, and materials were routinely lost, reinterred, or simply not preserved. The absence of those materials today does not confirm the claims made about them, but it does not disprove them either. What cannot be explained away is the textual record. The Dead Sea Scrolls fragment designated 4Q531, part of the Book of Giants collection, preserves a partial account of the giants' physical dimensions and behavior. The fragment is damaged, but the Aramaic text that survives is consistent with 1 Enoch's description of beings whose size and appetite place them outside normal human categories. This is not a medieval legend. This is a manuscript dated paleographically to the 1st or 2nd century BCE, found in a sealed cave, written by a community that treated it as theological record. The question that archaeology cannot answer, and that the textual tradition refuses to close, is this: if the giant clans the Bible names by location were still present centuries after the flood, still occupying named cities, still appearing in military records, still producing identifiable descendants with documentable physical traits. At what point exactly does the story end?
Nephilim. And they've survived. And they're living in, they're very primitive. They're feral. They're hostile. And they're very dangerous.
Because the biblical text never gives that point. It simply stops mentioning them. It does not say they were gone. It does not record their extinction. It records battles, survivors who fled to coastal cities, and then a silence. And into that silence, 4 separate ancient cultures, none of them reading each other's records, walked in and said the exact same thing. Here is what should not be possible. A civilization in the highlands of ancient Ethiopia, a scribal community in the Judean desert, a city-state archive in what is now southern Iraq, and a temple tradition preserved in the Sanskrit texts of the Indian subcontinent. 4 bodies of literature, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of development, with no documented direct contact at the times their oldest layers were composed. And all 4 of them record, independently, a moment in deep human prehistory when beings from outside the normal human order descended, interfered with human reproduction, produced hybrid offspring of violent capability, and were judged for it. This is the convergence problem, and it is one of the most uncomfortable data points in the entire field of ancient comparative religion. The Mahabharata and the Puranas of ancient India describe the Daityas and Danava, a class of beings of extraordinary power, born from divine human or divine demigod unions, who wage war against the cosmic order and are ultimately bound or destroyed by divine intervention. The Rigveda, estimated by scholars to contain material going back to at least 1500 BCE, describes the Asuras in early passages as powerful divine beings who later become adversarial, a trajectory that mirrors the Watcher tradition in 1 Enoch almost exactly. Divine origin, transgression, corruption, judgment. The Sanskrit materials have been studied comparatively by scholars including Wendy Doniger and Jan Gonda. The structural parallel to the Genesisenic tradition is acknowledged in academic literature, even when the conclusions drawn from it remain contested. The Sumerian King List, a cuneiform document with copies surviving from as early as 2100 BCE, records kings who reigned before a great flood with lifespans measured in tens of thousands of years. After the flood, lifespans dropped dramatically. The text does not explain why. It simply records the before and after as historical data, the same way a modern census record would document a population change. The beings governing humanity before the flood are presented as categorically different from those governing it after, longer lived, more powerful, and connected to divine origin. The Egyptian concept of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, describes a group of semi-divine beings said to have ruled Egypt in the period before the first human pharaohs. The Turin King List, a papyrus document dating to the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, includes these figures as a distinct category at the head of the list, separated from the human dynastic line by a deliberate break in the recording format. Mainstream Egyptology treats this as mythological framing. A smaller but credentialed group of researchers in ancient Near Eastern studies has pointed out that the Egyptians themselves made no such distinction. They recorded the Shemsu Hor in the same administrative format they used for historical kings. None of these traditions were comparing notes. The Sumerian king list was not available to the Ethiopian scribes preserving 1 Enoch. The Vedic traditions of India had no documented pipeline to the Qumran community copying the Book of Giants in the Judean desert. The Egyptian Turin papyrus was not being cross-referenced against Genesis in any ancient library. And yet the shape of the story is the same. Divine beings, human contact, hybrid offspring, catastrophic judgment, and in every single tradition, without exception, a question left unresolved about what happened to the lineage after the judgment ended. The question is not whether ancient people imagined giants. The question is why isolated, unconnected cultures told the same specific story about their origin, their transgression, and the incompleteness of their end. One answer, the answer that several mainstream scholars will not say in print, but that sits plainly in the textual evidence, is that all of them were remembering the same event. And the reason that answer has been kept out of popular history for generations has nothing to do with the evidence. It has everything to do with who had the authority to decide which documents the world was allowed to read, and which ones were quietly removed from the shelves. 363 CE, a council of bishops gathered in the city of Laodicea, the same Laodicea addressed in the Book of Revelation, and they made a list. The list was of books considered acceptable for public reading in Christian churches. The Book of Enoch was not on it. Neither was the Book of Giants. Neither was the Book of Jubilees, which contains its own detailed account of the Watchers and the Nephilim. In a single administrative decision, texts that the earliest Jewish and Christian communities had treated as spiritually authoritative for centuries were reclassified, not destroyed, not debated into irrelevance, simply removed from the approved list and allowed to disappear from the libraries of ordinary believers. This is how suppression actually works. It does not need fire. It needs patience and institutional authority. The Council of Laodicea was not the first such decision and not the last. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most prolific biblical scholars of the early church writing in the 3rd century CE, engaged seriously with 1 Enoch as a theological text. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, argued explicitly that the Book of Enoch should be considered scripture precisely because of its relevance to the Genesis 6 account of the Nephilim. Jerome, who produced the Latin Vulgate Bible in the late 4th century, the translation that would dominate Western Christianity for 1,000 years, excluded Enoch from his canon and expressed skepticism about its authority. One man's translation decision, institutionalized across a millennium, shaped what an entire civilization was allowed to know about its own spiritual history. And yet the text survived, not because of any single dramatic act of preservation, because of geography and community stubbornness. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its Christianity to the 4th century CE, to the conversion of the Aksumite kingdom under King Ezana, documented in both Ethiopian royal inscriptions and in the writings of the church historian Rufinus. When the Western Church was narrowing its canon, the Ethiopian Church was not under the same institutional pressures. It kept what it had. The result is the most expansive biblical canon in the world, 81 books compared to the Protestant 66 and the Catholic 73. First Enoch is not an appendix in the Ethiopian Bible. It is scripture. It has been copied, studied, and liturgically read in Ethiopian churches for 16 centuries without interruption. The Qumran community preserved it for different reasons. The Dead Sea Scrolls include more copies of 1 Enoch than of most books now considered canonical. 7 or 8 partial manuscripts of Enoch's text were recovered from the caves, compared to, for instance, a single copy of several of the minor prophets. The community at Qumran was not fringe. It was a serious, disciplined scribal community whose library represents the most significant cache of ancient Jewish texts ever discovered. That this community valued Enoch above many canonical texts is not a minor footnote. It is a data point about what ancient Jewish scholarship considered worth preserving at the cost of considerable effort. The institutional logic of removal is not difficult to understand. The Enochic tradition raises questions that are harder to manage inside a structured religious institution than they are inside an ancient desert community unconcerned with public order.
So you have in Genesis chapter 6 this very, cryptic passage of the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and they came and they slept with them. And these women gave birth to these children that were the Nephilim.
If the Watchers genuinely descended and corrupted human genetics and culture, then what exactly is the nature of the spiritual war described throughout the rest of Scripture? If the Nephilim lineage persisted after the flood, as the biblical text itself records in Numbers, Joshua, and Samuel, then what ended it, and did it end? If divine beings can transgress divine order with consequences that propagate through human bloodlines across centuries, then the story of human history is not a simple arc of sin, redemption, and restoration. It is something older and more structurally complicated, and complicated stories are harder to govern by. That is not conspiracy. That is institutional behavior, consistent across every large organization in human history. Information that complicates the management of belief gets moved to the edges. It does not disappear. It waits. It waited in Ethiopia for 1,600 years. It waited in the Judean desert in sealed clay jars for 2,000 years. It waited in Aramaic fragments too damaged for casual readers to reconstruct without specialist training. And then 1947 arrived. A Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave and heard pottery break, and everything that had been waiting began to surface. But here is what the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls forced into the open. A question that the fragments themselves do not answer, that no council ever addressed, and that sits at the center of every Nephilim tradition across every culture that preserved one. If the judgment described in Genesis 6, in 1 Enoch, in 2 Peter, and in Jude was directed at the bodies of the Nephilim, at their physical presence, what happened to what they carried? What happened to the knowledge the Watchers gave them? What happened to the patterns of corruption, the structural rebellion against divine order, the spiritual inheritance of beings who were never fully human to begin with? Because the manuscripts do not say that was destroyed. They only say the bodies were. In January 2016, Joe Rogan sat across from author Graham Hancock on his podcast and asked a question that had no business being asked on a mainstream platform with millions of listeners. He asked whether the mythological traditions of ancient civilizations, the giants, the flood narratives, the divine beings who taught humanity, might be pointing at something real that modern archaeology was not equipped or willing to examine. The episode was downloaded tens of millions of times. The comments section filled within hours, not with dismissal, with recognition. People who had never read a line of 1 Enoch wrote that they had always felt something was missing from the version of history they were taught. That reaction is a data point, not proof of anything about the Nephilim specifically, but proof that the question has never gone away, and that when it surfaces in public, it lands with a weight that purely mythological stories do not carry.
That they tend to be extremely beautiful as well. In other words, I should say beautiful, but really attractive. That there's something about them that you just go, whoa, that's so cool. It's so awesome because they're godlike.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're horrifying.
Every email we get is in that category usually.
Mel Gibson, in multiple documented interviews discussing his 2004 film The Passion of the Christ and his long-standing interest in biblical history, has referenced the existence of a spiritual war that he believes is not metaphorical. He has spoken publicly about the Book of Enoch, about the nature of the beings described in early Christian and Jewish tradition, and about his conviction that what the modern world treats as ancient mythology was recorded as literal event by the people who wrote it down. Gibson is not a theologian. His opinions are not evidence. But his willingness to voice these convictions publicly, at the cost of considerable professional friction, is a marker of how seriously some people who have actually read the primary texts take the question. These are not fringe voices operating in obscurity. They are documented, public conversations happening at the center of mainstream media, and they are echoing something that the ancient record has been saying continuously for 3,000 years. Matthew 24:37 records Jesus of Nazareth making a specific historical comparison. He does not compare the days before final judgment to any other period in human history. He compares them specifically to the days of Noah. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. The days of Noah in the biblical text are defined by Genesis 6, by the presence of the Nephilim, by the corruption of human society, by violence filling the earth, and by a divine response so extreme it required the near-total reset of human civilization. Jesus chose that specific moment as his reference point, not the Tower of Babel, not Sodom, not Egypt, Noah, the moment the Nephilim were present. This is not a peripheral observation in Christian theology. It sits in the Olivet Discourse, one of the most studied passages in the New Testament, delivered by Jesus directly to his disciples on the Mount of Olives as a response to their question about the end of the age. And it has largely been preached past, because the full weight of the comparison requires engaging with what the days of Noah actually contained. Most modern preaching reduces it to a general statement about moral decline. But the text is specific. It names a period defined by the presence of beings the rest of Scripture struggles to fully categorize.
What would your conclusion be then on the historical reliability of the Book of Enoch? Do you believe this is something that, reading the events outlined in Enoch and descriptions of what happened, do you think it gives us a relatively reliable historical account?
The Book of Enoch, in its section known as the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, describes a period at the end of human history that mirrors its description of the antediluvian world with disturbing structural precision. Violence, corruption of knowledge, beings of spiritual power operating without accountability, and a remnant of humanity that preserves what is true against the weight of what has been distorted. The parallel is not subtle. It is built into the architecture of the text intentionally, the same way a builder uses load-bearing walls. The Ethiopian Church has been reading that parallel for 16 centuries. The Qumran community was reading it 2,000 years ago. And now, in a media environment where the most listened to conversations in the world are returning again and again to the same questions, about hidden history, about the nature of human origins, about whether the ancient record was suppressed, the parallel is becoming visible to audiences who have never held a manuscript fragment in their hands. This is not coincidence. This is what happens when a question is too structurally important to stay buried. It resurfaces. It finds new vehicles. It speaks through podcasts and films and comment sections the way it once spoke through scrolls and oral tradition and the memories of communities living in desert isolation. And what it is saying, what it has always been saying, is that the story of humanity's origin includes a disruption that has never been fully resolved. Not theologically, not archaeologically, not in the silence of 4 words at the end of Genesis 6:4. The theological implications of that disruption are not abstract. They are not confined to ancient history. They land in the present moment with a weight that the next chapter of this account makes impossible to avoid. There is a framework running underneath the entire biblical narrative that most readers never fully see because it is never explained in a single passage. It has to be assembled across Genesis, Daniel, the Psalms, the prophets, the Gospels, and the letters of Peter and Jude. When it is assembled, the story of the Nephilim stops being a curiosity from an ancient text and becomes the opening chapter of something that is still being written. The framework is this. The rebellion recorded in Genesis 6 was not the first act of cosmic opposition to divine order, and it was not the last. It was one episode in a conflict that the biblical text tracks from before human history into human history and beyond it. Psalm 82, a text that generated enormous controversy in early Jewish interpretation, opens with God standing in a divine assembly and pronouncing judgment against beings described as Elohim, a Hebrew word that in this context cannot mean human judges, as some translations attempt to render it. The psalm accuses these beings of judging unjustly, of showing partiality to the wicked, of failing to defend the vulnerable. It ends with a sentence that reframes the entire human political order. I said, "You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince." Divine beings, given authority over nations, failing in that authority, being sentenced to mortality. The Dead Sea Scrolls community read Psalm 82 as a direct reference to the Watchers and their judgment. Michael Heiser, a scholar with a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whose academic work on the Divine Council framework appeared in peer-reviewed journals before reaching a popular audience, spent years documenting what he called the Divine Council worldview embedded throughout the Hebrew Bible. His conclusion, supported by extensive textual analysis, is that the biblical authors understood the spiritual world to contain a hierarchy of beings with genuine agency, genuine authority delegated from God over nations and peoples, and genuine capacity for rebellion. The Nephilim in this reading are not an anomaly. They are a consequence, the physical and historical result of a specific category of divine rebellion that the text tracks with careful continuity from Genesis through Revelation. 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6 both describe the imprisoned watchers in terms that carry a specific timeline. They are held in confinement until judgment. The Greek word Peter uses, Tartaros, is the deepest level of the Greek underworld, used in Greek literature to describe the imprisonment of the Titans after their defeat by the Olympian gods. Peter's audience would have recognized the category immediately. These are beings of primordial power, confined but not destroyed, waiting for a verdict that has not yet been executed.
In regards to things like that, getting the black hats and the white hats, correct, presenting this as a transgression. This is not something good, it's something sinister and evil. Portraying it as something that, did occur, again, however we parse it, however.
The Book of Revelation chapter 9 describes beings released from a shaft called the Abyss, described in terms of devastating capacity, operating under a named ruler, unleashed at a specific point in the end-time sequence. Whether one reads Revelation as past, present, or future, the structural category it is drawing on is identical to the Watcher tradition. Powerful non-human beings in confinement, scheduled for release. This is the theological payload that the removal of 1 Enoch from the Western canon made harder to see. Not impossible, it is still visible in the canonical text if one reads across it carefully, but harder. The Enochic tradition functions as the lens that brings the biblical narrative's cosmic war framework into sharp focus. Without it, the Nephilim seem like a strange detour in Genesis, a briefly mentioned oddity before the flood story proper begins. With it, they are the central exhibit in the case the biblical authors are building across 39 books and 1,500 years of literary tradition, that human history is not simply human, that it has been contested, interfered with, and shaped by beings outside the human order, and that the contest is not over. The implications are not comfortable. They never were. The scribes at Qumran were not comfortable. Tertullian was not comfortable. The Ethiopian Church did not preserve 1 Enoch because it made things simpler. It preserved it because the community that maintained it believed that a true account of the world, however uncomfortable, was more valuable than a tidy one. Here is where honest narration requires a moment of acknowledgement. The full picture of what the Nephilim were, what the Watchers intended, and what the lasting effects of that ancient transgression are, no single scholar has it completely. The manuscripts are damaged. The languages are ancient. The interpretive traditions diverge. Anyone who tells this story with total certainty is going beyond what the evidence supports. What the evidence supports is this: something happened. Multiple independent ancient traditions recorded it. The record was partially suppressed. What survived is coherent enough to disturb and specific enough to demand engagement rather than dismissal. The cosmic war is not a metaphor the ancient world invented to explain thunder and earthquakes. It is the framework through which the biblical authors understood every political event, every military campaign, every moment of cultural corruption and spiritual decline they recorded. And if that framework is accurate, if the rebellion of Genesis 6 introduced a pattern of spiritual disruption into human history that did not end with the flood, then the question is no longer what happened in the ancient world. The question is what that ancient disruption looks like right now, in the present moment, inside the life of every person watching this account unfold. This is the moment to stop moving through ancient history and look directly at where this story places the person hearing it. The manuscript does not prove giants are walking the earth in physical form. That is not what the ancient record claims, and it is not what the textual evidence supports. What the manuscript proves, what the convergence of Genesis, 1 Enoch, the Book of Giants, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Ethiopian canon, and the independent testimony of Sumerian, Ugaritic, and Sanskrit tradition proves, is that the question survived. Across every attempt to silence it, narrow it, lock it in a vault, remove it from a canon, or reduce it to fairy tale, the question came back. In every generation, in every civilization that kept its oldest memories intact. That survival is not accidental. Nothing survives 2,000 years in a sealed jar in a desert cave, gets discovered by a shepherd's thrown rock, gets translated by scholars who then fight among themselves for 40 years about whether to publish it, gets preserved simultaneously in the most ancient Christian canon on earth, and lands in front of the eyes of someone watching this account right now, by accident. Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were present before the flood. Then it says, and also after that. Those 4 words are the hinge on which this entire investigation turns. After the flood, the giant clans appear in Canaan, named, located, described in military records. After the battles of Joshua, survivors are recorded fleeing to Philistine coastal cities. After the Philistine period, the lineage disappears from the text without a recorded ending. The Bible does not say they were gone. It stops naming them. There is a difference between those two things, and the ancient world knew it. 1 Enoch chapter 15 records the divine response to the destruction of the Nephilim's physical bodies. The text states that their spirits, the spirits of the giant offspring, did not simply cease at death. They became what the text calls evil spirits on the earth, homeless, unembodied, described as agents of corruption, affliction, and deception operating in the human world after the physical giants themselves were gone. This is the tradition that the New Testament draws on when it describes the casting out of unclean spirits. The Greek word used in the Gospels for the entities Jesus encountered and expelled, daimonia, carries in its oldest usage the sense of a being of uncertain origin and dangerous capacity, operating between the human and divine worlds. The Enochic tradition provides the origin account that the New Testament assumes without explaining. The pattern of the days of Noah, which Jesus specifically named as the template for the final period of human history, includes not just physical corruption but spiritual corruption. Not just giants in the land, but a distortion of truth so complete that, in the words of Genesis 6:5, every intention of the human heart was only evil continually. That kind of comprehensive moral and spiritual corruption does not require giants to be physically present. It requires the pattern of the Watcher rebellion, the overriding of created order, the corruption of knowledge, the displacement of divine truth with something that looks authoritative but serves destruction, to be operating in the cultural and spiritual fabric of a society. Look at what is happening right now. Information that was once suppressed is surfacing everywhere simultaneously. Ancient texts are being digitized and made available to anyone with an internet connection. Questions that would have been laughed out of academic conferences 20 years ago are now being engaged by credentialed scholars in peer-reviewed publications. The convergence of ancient traditions that 5 different isolated civilizations preserved in almost identical form is no longer a specialist curiosity. It is a conversation happening in the most listened-to media in the world. The pattern of Noah's days, according to Matthew 24, includes one more specific detail that almost every preacher skips. Jesus says that the people of that time did not know what was coming until the flood arrived and took them all. They were eating, drinking, marrying, not out of wickedness particularly, but out of unawareness. They were living inside a story whose true shape they could not see because no one around them was nomming it correctly. The person hearing this right now is not in that position. The manuscripts exist. The evidence has been documented. The convergence is visible. The question is no longer whether the ancient record preserved something real about the nature of human history and the spiritual forces contesting it. The question is whether what was deliberately hidden for centuries, preserved in desert jars, in Ethiopian liturgy, in Aramaic fragments too damaged for casual reading, means anything to the person who just encountered it. Because the same God who warned through Enoch, who preserved the text through 2,000 years of silence, who allowed a shepherd's throne rock to crack open a cave in 1947, that same deliberate providence is the reason this story reached this moment. The ancient record does not end with the flood. It does not end with Joshua's campaigns. It does not end with the binding of the watchers in Tartarus. It ends with a judgment still scheduled, a question still open, and a world still living inside the tension of 4 words that Genesis never explained. And also after that, the question is not whether this is real. The manuscripts are real. The convergence is real. The suppression is documented. The question, the only question that matters at the end of this account, is what someone does with the weight of knowing that the story of humanity's deepest disruption was never fully closed, and that every ancient community that understood that fact considered the knowledge not a reason for fear, but a reason for clarity. There is one question the ancient manuscripts raise that no council ever voted on, no translation ever resolved, and no archaeological excavation has answered. It is not a question about the size of skeletal remains. It is not a question about which fragments survived and which burned. It is the question that Genesis planted in 4 words and never took back. And it is the question this entire investigation has been circling from the moment that burned fragment was pulled from Cave 4 at Qumran. If the corruption introduced by the Watchers left a spiritual inheritance in the human world, if the pattern of rebellion they established did not die with their offspring's bodies, then what is that inheritance and where does it operate? That question has no clean answer in the canonical text. It was not answered by the flood. It was not answered by Joshua's military campaigns. It was not answered by the binding of the Watchers in Tartarus. Every tradition that preserved the Enochic account kept asking it in every generation. The Ethiopian Church is still reading 1 Enoch in its liturgy. The text has not gone quiet. The Dead Sea Scrolls are still being translated and published. The final volumes of the official discoveries in the Judean Desert series ran into the early 2000s, and smaller fragments continue to surface and be analyzed. The scholarly conversation about what the Watchers' tradition means for understanding the New Testament is more active now than it was 50 years ago. Michael Heiser's work on the Divine Council reached audiences in the millions before his death in 2023. The question is not retreating, it is expanding. Here is what this account has established from the primary sources, not from theory, not from speculation, but from manuscripts, inscriptions, and textual records that exist and can be examined. The Genesis text records the Nephilim before and after the flood. The Book of Enoch, preserved at Qumran in multiple copies, preserved in Ethiopia as scripture, quoted in the New Testament, records the origin of the Nephilim in the transgression of the Watchers and the post-mortem fate of the Nephilim's spirits as ongoing agents of disruption. The Book of Giants records the giants' own awareness of coming judgment and their failed attempt to seek intercession from Enoch. Named giant clans appear in the Hebrew text across 4 books of the Bible, located in specific cities that archaeology has confirmed. Jesus of Nazareth named the days of Noah specifically as the template for the final period of human history. And the Council of Laodicea removed from the approved canon the text that explains most completely what the days of Noah actually contained. That is the record. It is not complete. No ancient record is. It is damaged in places, contested in others, and deliberately narrowed by institutional decisions that had as much to do with organizational management as with theological truth. But what survives is coherent, convergent across cultures, and old enough to predate any possibility of coordinated invention. The next investigation on this channel goes somewhere the Nephilim account points but does not fully enter. There is a manuscript tradition, preserved outside the Western canon, connected to the same Qumran library and describing the same cosmic war framework, that contains a specific account of what the Watchers taught humanity before the flood. Not their transgression, their curriculum, the knowledge they transferred. The Book of Watchers section of 1 Enoch lists it by subject: metalworking, enchantments, the cutting of roots, astrology, and the arts of deception. Ancient knowledge that the text frames not as neutral science but as tools for a specific purpose. And the question of whether that knowledge left a traceable mark on the civilizations that came after, on the architectural feats, the astronomical precision, the ritual systems of cultures that appeared fully developed with no clear developmental record, is the question that makes everything in this account look like the introduction. That story has been hidden for 1,000 years inside a tradition that almost no one in the Western world has been told exists. It surfaces next. If this account opens something in the way human history reads, if the manuscripts and the convergence and the 4 words at the end of Genesis 6, 4 landed with a weight that a purely mythological story would not carry, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications right now. Because every investigation published here is built the same way this one was, from primary sources, from documented textual evidence, from the ancient record that has survived every attempt to reduce it to legend. The community building around these questions is not a fringe. It is people who have decided that the world's oldest memories deserve to be read with the same seriousness the communities that preserved them brought to the task. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What the ancient communities knew and what the councils tried to narrow belongs in the conversation. Your perspective is part of how this investigation continues. Share this account with someone who has always felt that the version of human history they were taught was missing its most important chapter, because it was. And the manuscripts that prove it have been waiting, in climate-controlled vaults and Ethiopian liturgy and desert cave fragments, for exactly this moment. The question that Genesis never answered is still open. The record that survived says it was always meant to be.